Good afternoon, everyone. It brings me immense joy to extend a warm welcome to each one of you for another enriching edition of the ICS's Wednesday seminar. My name is Ritika Sharan. I am a research intern at the Institute of Chinese Studies, and I'm honored to serve as the Master of Ceremonies for today's event. The title of today's seminar is The World Order That China Seeks. As Sun Tzu mentions, the supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. This is the evident strategic posture of China, which is eyeing to replace the US in terms of establishing its hegemony. China has always been an ambitious Asian power, and with its exponential rise, it seeks to be at the center. To fulfill this purpose, China has established plurilateral institutions while strengthening bilateral ties with all kinds of economies. It has been consistently taking multiple projects engaging nations all over in the hopes of pushing US to the edge. It has also successfully proved to be a principal threat to India, which has nudged the latter to a multi alignment foreign policy. The speaker for today's session is Ambassador Mohan Kumar, who served in the Indian Foreign Services for 36 long years and retired as India's ambassador to France in 2017. For more than 6 years now, he is a full time academic, serving as both dean and professor at the prestigious O.P. Jindal Global University. He has written two books so far. The latest one is India's Moment, published in November 2023 by HarperCollins India. Ambassador Kumar has an MBA from the Faculty of Management Studies in University of Delhi and a PhD from the prestigious Sciences Po University in Paris. We are pleased to have you here, sir. The seminar will be chaired by Ambassador Vijay K. Nambia, an honorary fellow at the Institute of Chinese Studies, a former Indian ambassador and former representative of India to the United Nations. He served as High Commissioner to Afghanistan, Malaysia, China, and Pakistan. Post retirement, he served as Deputy National Security Advisor of India. He was then deputed as a special advisor to Secretary General Kofi Annan, Chef de Cabinet to Ban Ki-moon, and later advisor on Myanmar. We extend our gratitude to you for joining us today, sir. Before I hand over to the chair, I would request all participants to adhere to some housekeeping rules. All participants are requested to remain muted during the presentation. You may post your questions in the chat box. Alternatively, you may use the raise your hand option during the interactive session. After the presentation, you will be called upon to unmute yourself and ask questions. Please remember to mention your name and affiliation while posting your questions. I now hand over the floor to the chair to take the proceedings forward. Over to you, Ambassador Nambia. Thank you.
Thank you, Ritika. It's an honor to be here. Ambassador Mohan Kumar, of course, is a distinguished colleague and a good friend. He has a formidable reputation as a thinker, scholar, diplomat, and dare I say, even as a policy wonk. The subject he has chosen, the world order that China seeks, has important implications for both India and the world at many levels. I'm sure he will deal with it both, will bring to it both the intellectual policy as well as the practical aspects in his analysis. Over the past decades, alongside China's phenomenal growth story, there has also been a burgeoning scholarly discourse within the country and outside on China's place in the world order, whether in terms of its own historical tradition or in the evolving and emerging world order of today. Over the 2.5 decades of this century, we have seen many such discourses. To mention just a few, we might recall the so-called humane world order developed by Professor Yan Xuetung, as also the decentered and non-hierarchical universalism, or what they call Tianxia O2 approach of a scholar like Xu Jinlin, down to the present period of Xi Jinping, where scholars like Cui Liruo and Li Ziguo have spoken of a China that will move away from being a detached observer within the international system to one who will be an active participant in developing new rules for the world order, one that is non-Western in orientation and whose focus will be not on pronouncing political systems as good or bad, but on seeking development rights for all. Stripped of official rhetoric, however, Beijing's vision of a new world order appears strikingly narrow and parochial. It is mostly about confronting a Western-dominated liberal order seen as threatening to the Chinese Communist Party and opposed to China's rise. For example, the director of the CSIR's Institute of World Politics, Wang Honggang, sees China's shaping of the international order by breaking the Western discourse monopoly on human rights issues of what he calls cultivating strategic support points, helping countries of the South to oppose foreign interference and infiltration, and preventing color revolutions. The Chinese party elite is impatient to replace a declining West by a rising East. The West's dominance is said to be unsustainable. And while there are struggles and uncertainties as to who will control the international discourse power, this changed order will embody a new type of international relationships, win-win cooperation, justice and benefit, and the construction of what is called a network of partnerships to ultimately form a community of common destiny. Beijing has been extending its role as a maritime great power across the East and South China Seas and beyond through the Indian Ocean towards Africa, as well as farther into the Pacific. Through the SCO and the BRICS, it has propagated new kinds of diplomacy based on mutual interest and without Western interference. It has used the BRI and the Digital Silk Road network to build a network of ports, railways, pipelines, industrial parks, power stations, connecting continents and stimulating world trade. These initiatives are designed to create a stable zone of influence for Beijing in a world of turmoil and transformation. Though the BRI has undergone attrition due to various problems like debt sustainability, social and environmental impacts, lack of transparency, image of cronyism and influence peddling, there is a continuing reassessment of the strategies and modalities which China is undertaking. Also, new modalities such as the GDI, the Global Development Initiative, the Global Security Initiative, the Global Civilizational Initiative, seek to concretize the vision of a comprehensive, cooperative, and sustainable order, which purportedly avoids imposing its own values and political government models on other countries and encourages greater mutual respect and for diversity of civilizations. Now, in 2015, David Schomburg spoke of the soft power ventures of China to construct an alternative architecture to the post-war, post-Western order. He claimed that China had pledged about $1.41 trillion, or over 100 times that of the Marshall Plan, to propagate its own model of world politics. There is, however, even in China, some questioning of this model. Some scholars publicly spoke of the collapse of the communist ideology, having left the party without any real belief systems, bereft of ideals, and reduced to using threadbare formulations. The former Tsinghua University professor Xu Jianrun felt that the regime's ideological heart was dead. According to, of course, the Chinese origin scholar Wang Fei Ling of Georgia Tech, who is the author of the China Order, the Chinese multinational state is itself based on a manufactured ideology and was not real. Despite the re-enshrining of Confucianism in China and the plethora of Confucius institutes around the world, it remains today, he says, just a decoration. The Chinese people suffered from a loss of traditional morals and traditional ethics. On the other hand, Western standards based on democracy and market economy is also rejected. He says that leaves people with no moral compass or multiple moral compasses. He even went further to say that to most Chinese people, the government showering of money all over the place, as he calls it, was wasting Chinese money and not necessarily for Chinese interests at all. Now, how representative are these views? It's difficult to determine. But contrary to the voices of pessimism among some Chinese scholars, many international economists like Barry Norton, who spoke recently at the Gargi and VP Dutt Memorial Lecture, and people like Nicholas Lardy, give a far more nuanced kind of a message. Let me end quickly by referring to some of Professor Norton's theses. He had said that the world can no longer expect the kind of miracle growth in China of the earlier decades, but there has been a fundamental change in China's economic policy since the rise of Xi Jinping. Chinese objectives have changed away from a growth model that stresses increasing incomes and expanding domestic consumption for its people to one that highlights the strengthening of the Chinese nation and making it a technology superpower. Under Xi's leadership, the party has turned away from market-oriented reform in favor of centralized decision-making, top-down resource allocation, and marginalizing the private sector. While the economy is likely to be less efficient and perhaps factor productivity or total factor productivity growth would probably, he says, reduce to around 2 percentage points and cause strains in the budget of local governments. And probably there will not be any stimulus policy or efforts to boost domestic consumption. The major focus will be on economic policy will be on pumping money into high-tech industry and building China's self-reliance across the board. This year's national two sessions, the government underlined China's biggest focus is on shifting to future industries, a comprehensive approach to modernize China's industrial system to innovation. It talks about pooling resources to achieve scientific breakthroughs, acquire advanced computer designs to be used for hypersonic missiles, artificial intelligence, and it identifies electric vehicles, batteries, solar and solar cells industries as among the new productive forces that will boost the country's overall productivity growth. It says that the aim is to consolidate and enhance China's leading position in several of these sectors. Defense spending is also rising faster than overall government spending and revenue generation. This is meant, according to them, to brace China for the long-term challenges from the US in the struggle for world hegemony. Nicholas Lardy again says that it would be a mistake to underestimate China's resilience despite the record of the past few years. In the years ahead, he says, China is likely to expand to twice the rate of the US and will continue to contribute a third of the world's economic growth while increasing its economic footprint, especially in Asia. The aim is clear: to reach the pinnacle of world power. How will that impact the world? What kind of an order will that then bring about? And will that be what China seeks itself? How will that come about? These comments are only meant as a chapeau. I now call upon Ambassador Mohan Kumar to give us the benefit of his own expert observations. The floor is yours, Mohan.
Thank you very much, sir. I want to thank the Institute of Chinese Studies for this unprecedented honor. Unprecedented because I never served in China and I don't fancy myself as a China expert. But sometimes it is useful, I think, to offer your ideas and opinions just based on China's behavior and on objective reality, divorced completely from the knowledge of what goes on within China in terms of the politics and so on. So I don't pretend to be able to say things which are comprehensive, but they will, I think, give you a point of view which I think you could take into account while looking at China's behavior. So I call it the objective reality assessment of China's behavior. And I just wanted to clarify that. I want to thank two of my very, very senior colleagues. One, Ambassador Rana, for having suggested this idea. I'm deeply grateful to you, sir, for finding me fit to do this. And I, of course, want to thank Ambassador Vijay Nambiar for agreeing to chair the session and for taking the time out. I just want to divide my remarks just for the sake of convenience in terms of political security and economics, or political, economic, and security. But that is just really for the sake of convenience, because China has a tendency to really look at things in a holistic manner. The first remark I will make has already been made by Ambassador Vijay Nambiar and should be known to all of you. Those even who have a smattering of knowledge of China will know that China's overarching objective is to replace the United States of America. This is not in doubt, but there are some implications you can draw from this particular statement, which is that the Chinese really don't take EU seriously. They do not believe the EU has any kind of power which resembles what they have. It certainly does not consider Japan as a great power, for example. So there are some assumptions that you can make on the basis of the fact that just as the US thinks China is the pacing challenge, as they call it, it is really a sentiment that is reciprocated in kind by China. They believe there is only one power that can stop their inevitable rise, and that is the United States of America. The Chinese nightmare, I believe, is that they could have a regime change because of the US. Their nightmare is also that they could suffer the fate of the Soviet Union, the erstwhile Soviet Union, again, because of actions by the US. So these two things really, I think, guide the Chinese in their overall strategy. I think China wants to replace the US with minimum of disruption to itself and probably even the world, because the Chinese don't like disruption too much. It throws a spanner in the works in terms of their own calculus. So, but if need be, they have no problem in accepting that the world has to undergo some disruptive changes. I think they're more bothered about disruptive changes at home. But
Oops. What happened? Sorry, can you hear me?
I think,
Yes,
yeah,
sir, we
Mohan
can
is
hear
back.
you. Or you are still
yes, can you hear me now?
Yeah, very good. Good. Yes, back.
Yes, sir.
Okay, good. So maybe I should get on with it. I'm actually doing this from my university in Sonipat, so my apologies about the connectivity issues. So I think that the Chinese are acutely aware that the unipolar moment is over. I think that they have no doubt, and it's unlikely to repeat itself again. But they also realize there are some serious gaps in terms of hard power between themselves and the Americans. And that is a gap they will try hard to close, but that's not going to be easy. In between, and meanwhile, they would not be opposed to a G2 system of governance. In fact, in all the climate change negotiations that I have been part of, it's always been, you can always notice that the US and China get together and do a joint statement before the climate change conference, which then becomes the template for the entire conference. We were taken a little bit by surprise in Paris, the COP21, when that happened, despite Barack Obama and so on. So that was a clear example of the manifestation of G2. So they would have been happy with G2 pending a situation where they could be the preeminent power calling their shots. But unfortunately, I think the serious friction between US and China makes this G2 now a remote possibility. So what is the alternative? The alternative is, I think, clearly a non-Western multipolar world. That is what China is seeking. They're seeking a non-Western dominated multipolar world. Obviously, they will be at the helm of it, and others can join in. But the orientation is non-Western and non-American, if you like. This is something that is, I think, according to me, seen by the Chinese purely as a transitory measure until they can assume the helm of matters and until they can call the shots. In between, we are between two orders, and they think it will be a Sino-led order sooner or later. In between, they would have no problem paying lip service to a multipolar world order, but be very clear that this multipolar world order, into which Russians seem to have bought this in, but I have my doubts about others, it would be a non-Western multipolar world order. To achieve this strategic objective and this overarching objective, not losing sight of the fact that they eventually want to replace the United States, China is actually happy to use the existing architecture. You know, there is a mistaken notion in some quarters that China, by creating the BRICS or by supporting the BRICS or by spearheading the BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, seeks to somehow replace their single-minded focus on the UN. I would beg to disagree and say that they want to use the UN forum, the UN Security Council, for example. They would not be in favor of a reform which will bring in countries like Japan. Japan more than India, but certainly Japan, because it calls into question their preeminent role in Asia. So they would actually pay lip service, but they would not be really in favor of the UN Security Council reform. The UN General Assembly they use to try and be the leader of the global South. That is a forum in which they can try and see how much votes they can get. UN agencies, they have made it a policy to actually state that either the number one or the number two position should go to China. I was myself a victim of this when the government of India put forward my candidature as number two in international organizations on two occasions, actually. On both those occasions, the Chinese told the respective heads of those organizations that we will simply stop funding if you give this to Indian or to anybody else. So it's as simple as that. They are now the second most important contributor to the UN agencies. But if you see the UN agencies, their whole approach is to make sure if they can get the first position, yes, but at least the second position should be open to the Chinese. So that is what they are doing. Now, while seeking a non-Western multipolar world, one of the ways in which they do that is obviously initiatives like the BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Global Development Initiative, for example, which Ambassador Nambiar mentioned. So all these are actually part of the same initiative to promote a non-Western multipolar world order. I'll come to how India should approach this a little later, because while India also prefers and states that it wants a multipolar world order, the fact that China seeks a non-Western multipolar world order would be a problem for us. And that is the problem that we are seeing in the context of BRICS and SCO and so on. But that problem, I believe, will become sharper in the days and months to come. So I now want to go to the economic side of it. This is the political order, if you like, the overarching political order. They will create new structures, but I don't think they are unhappy with the existing structures. They will merely seek to augment their power in the context of the UN, in the IMF and the World Bank. They will strive for a bigger voice and so on. But I don't think they're going to throw the baby out with the bathwater. On economic order, until recently, China believed firmly that it would sooner or later overtake the United States. I think now serious questions are being posed both outside and within China. The question is not whether, and the question is not when China will overtake the US, but the question is whether China will overtake the US. I think this is something the Chinese have come to realize as well because of their per capita income, the levels of poverty, and so on. So economically, it's ironic that the world is only multipolar in an economic sense. It is not multipolar in a political or military sense because of the unbelievable power that the US still has. But despite it, I think China is going to look at the economic order and try and see whether non-discriminatory MFN-based trade can be maintained, because that is what has served them immensely. The best thing that happened to China was entry into the WTO. And as some of you know, the WTO obliges on every single WTO member to grant MFN. Until then, China had to send a delegation to United States every year and beg for MFN from the US. Once they became members of WTO, China now has MFN for granted. I mean, until recently, they could go to the dispute settlement, but now they can't. So the problem that China faces, ironically, is in the world economic order, not the political order and military orders to some extent, but it is really the economic order that is posing a big problem, because the WTO is really in the ICU. The WTO is the one which guaranteed China MFN and non-discriminatory treatment, but with everybody now abandoning the MFN route and taking to FTAs, and this whole business of resilient supply chains and technology denial regimes sought to be put on China, the biggest challenge that China faces is they will not be able to do the kind of export that they used to do. So the export-led model of economic development is out for China. They will not be able to do it the way they did before. And you saw the visit of the Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen to China recently, where everybody is jumping on China's overcapacity, industrial overcapacity problem, especially in electrical vehicles, in lithium-ion batteries, and in solar panels. So I think China realizes it's caught between a rock and a hard place from a world economic order point of view, because firstly, the multilateral trading system based on non-discrimination is not available for China or for anybody else. Secondly, China's dual consumption strategy, I would argue, has been a relative failure. It has not succeeded in boosting domestic demand. Domestic demand continues to be tepid. Savings rate is very high in China. And the three problems that China faces: one, an aging population, massive debt overhang, both private and public. 300% of GDP is debt today in China, and a cratering property sector, which constitutes something like 30 to 35% of GDP. The combination of these three factors, the fact that the multilateral trading system, which guaranteed non-discrimination, is not available, means, and the domestic market has not grown to the extent desirable. The question you have to ask yourself: what is China going to do with this massive capacity in goods? That's the question. And I think India should be extremely concerned as well, because if China cannot get into US and Europe, and if the US and Europe successfully prevent the export of Chinese goods and services, it will find its way somehow into East Asia and South Asia. They will give it away free to India's neighboring countries if necessary. That is how desperate they will be. So my biggest issue today for China, I think, is really the world economic order. China has cut down its ambitions on Belt and Road Initiative. I think everybody knows that. But China still has considerable clout because the overwhelming majority of countries in the world still call China its leading trade partner. That is, you can't take it away from them. So the real counter that China will have to put in place is how to tackle resilient supply chains, how to tackle a dollar-dominated system. A dollar-dominated system is a problem, and the technology denial regimes that are sought to be put in place. The American Congress has just passed a law saying, passed a bill saying that TikTok's original company, ByteDance, has to divest itself. Otherwise, they will not be able to operate in TikTok. A country like India, which is 5 times less powerful than China on any metric, is able to ban TikTok. That is bad news for China, because if a weak country like India, which is relatively weak compared to China, can do it, other countries will do it. So powerful countries like US will do it through law, India will do it otherwise, and that is, I think, really bad news. Whether Trump or Biden also makes a big difference from this perspective. On the one hand, they think they can do a deal with Trump. But Trump has already made it known that the first thing he will do is introduce a Trump Reciprocal Trade Act to vis-a-vis China. And he will have tariffs on Chinese products and services to the extent of 60 to 80%. Something, by the way, which even Janet Yellen has warned. So there is going to be no big change regardless of Biden or Trump. But to the extent Trump brings unpredictability into the system, that would be a problem for China. But otherwise, I don't think the problem is going away. What China has done, unwittingly or otherwise, they have managed to get a bipartisan consensus in the US against itself. And that takes some doing. In today's Congress in the US, where everything is bitterly divided, for China to kind of take actions which brings the whole American Congress together is an amazing achievement. I'm, of course, being sarcastic when I say that, because today's American Congress is incapable of deciding on anything, agreeing on anything, but they agree on China. So that takes some doing. I would be very interested in knowing how the Chinese will handle this, because they have a serious problem on their hands. I don't know too much about the internal Chinese economy, except to know the domestic demand is tepid. But the external environment does not look bright at all. And that is a major problem. They have to find a growth model. For example, in India, we have decided that trade is 40 to 45% of GDP, but we will go the investment route. So what India is doing is spending massively on infrastructure, which will then provide economic growth and boost economic growth. The Chinese cannot do it because they were there at least 20 years before. Their infrastructure boom is already over. So I'm very curious to know how the Chinese will handle this issue. And if I may be allowed to say so, this is, I think, the biggest factor which will play a part. This, along with internal security considerations, about which I know little, but I know enough to know that there is a securitization of Chinese politics that has happened under Xi. So that aspect, I don't know too much, but I think this is going to be a problem because it actually affects the fundamental social contract in China. The social contract in China, to the best of my understanding, is you give people better life year after year, and they are quite happy to give up political rights and accept the primacy of CCP and so on and so forth. But if that is seen to be not happening in an aging society where there are no pensions, where youngsters are talking about lying flat, whatever that means, this is, I think, a problem, frankly. And that is really the issue that stares the Chinese CCP in the face. I think there are a number of telltale signs that that the Chinese have not made up their minds. The cancellation of a press conference by the Prime Minister of China is a big thing, because most economic investors that I spoke to, they say that is the one conference where we look for signs and signals. So that has not happened. And if Xi Jinping wants to take over this particular domain as well, then he will have to be aware of the risks. If it works, he can take the credit. But if it doesn't work, then the blame stops with him and the buck stops with him. So that is the economic part of what is going on. There is a move in the WTO to do two things. One, completely change the subsidies law of the WTO so that Chinese subsidies do not continue, because there is a tremendous degree of opacity about how China grants subsidies to their state-owned enterprises, and the WTO is extremely unhappy with this. So there is going to be a change in the subsidies law. There are a number of countries within the WTO which are cooperating to deal with the overcapacity problem of China, which means there will be also changes to the dumping law. One of the reasons why the Americans have completely rendered the dispute settlement mechanism of the WTO impotent, not important, but impotent, is because of the appellate body rulings on anti-dumping. Anti-dumping was made difficult by the appellate body, and repeatedly, American actions on anti-dumping were not favored. The Chinese were favored. Similarly, the definition of what is a governmental body, a local body, what a governmental body, was again interpreted in favor of China, not the US. These were the two reasons why the Americans destroyed the dispute settlement mechanism of the WTO. So, but I don't think they're going to keep quiet, and America will not enter into negotiations and build a new dispute settlement mechanism unless Chinese subsidies are caught by the WTO net and the overcapacity problem and the anti-dumping issue is sorted out. So the Americans are very clear. Europeans also love it, but they will not say it. They are hiding behind the Americans. So that's the economic part of it. I will now move to the security side of the world order. It's again very clear that the overriding objective of the Chinese is to see the back of the US in the Pacific. It's simple. I mean, they have long argued that America has no business being in the Pacific. They are not a Pacific power, no matter what they say. This is our area. So leave us to do what we want to do. Now, this is easier said than done, because if you imagine yourself looking out of a Chinese coastal city, you will only see islands. And those first islands will be Japan, Taiwan, Philippines. This is what you will see from a coastal city in China. So that's the first island chain. My point about the Pacific is it is an amphibian theater. Most people think the Pacific area just contains a big ocean, which of course it does, But the battle will be fought on land. Let's be very clear. The battle will be fought on land. And therefore, it is the few, and real estate is very rare in Pacific. You've got these small islands, which is why you've got Japan, you've got Philippines, you've got Taiwan assuming a giant-sized importance in the Pacific. Plus, you've got islands like Solomon Islands, Micronesia, and others also assuming importance. So when Solomon Islands says we're going to have a base built by China, it cannot but be a matter of concern, not just for countries in the Pacific, but also for the United States. So I think that really is the main objective of China, no matter how long it takes. Now, in Asia, when it comes to security, while China may seek, and here is the contradiction, while China may seek a non-Western multipolar world order, they clearly do not seek a multipolar Asia. A multipolar Asia is against the vital national interest of China. Because a multipolar Asia will mean place for Japan, place for India, a place for South Korea, place for ASEAN, whatever it is. I mean, ASEAN are traditional fence-sitters, but even so. Now, this is certainly not in the interest of the Chinese. So Asia will continue to be a theater where the Chinese would like to actually prove their undisputed predominance. And that is something they would like to keep. Now, it is conscious of the power differential with United States in the Pacific. I mean, you see what is going on just now. You've got Lavrov visiting Beijing. And on the other hand, you have Kushida visiting Washington. And you're going to have the Philippines president also join US and Japan. Philippines is a very, very interesting case of how the policy has changed. And this is what the Chinese must reflect, because to get a country like Philippines, which was really with them until 5-6 years ago, now Philippines is doing things completely unimaginable 5 years ago. So what I think all this points to for me in the security realm, and this is my fundamental point, rather than look at an outright invasion of Taiwan, which essentially for me is inconceivable because of the huge power differential still between the US and China in the military domain, what they will, I think, do is create tension in South China Sea through actions. And those actions will be what I call incremental microaggressions. That is, that they will not be actions which can then become the headline in New York Times or Washington Post saying that China invades Taiwan or China smashes an American aircraft carrier. No. I think what is likely to happen is the Chinese strategy of pushing the envelope. You keep on pushing the envelope vis-a-vis the US to see what it is that will make the US react. So that is, I think, the real strategy. Both the conflict in Ukraine and the conflict in Gaza have been manna from heaven for China. They have bestowed enormous strategic space for China, and it increases the strategic options for China, frankly, especially the war in Ukraine, but even Gaza. So you have to balance two things. One is the power differential between US and China at this stage, but the fact that America's strategic width, can it handle three theaters? That is Gaza, Ukraine. Can it handle another one? That is a question that you have to ask yourself. When the Western countries don't have enough artillery shells for Ukraine, then what are we talking about? So I think that is something the Chinese will take into account. Be that as it may, my sense is the South China Sea is more likely to see action than Taiwan in that sense, because anything that happens in Taiwan will naturally create a furore. The two countries whose defense policy has changed because of China's actions, one I mentioned already, which is Philippines. The second is Japan. For Japan now to be looking at things which they couldn't look at 20 years ago is just unbelievable. I mean, the only thing, it'll be interesting to see what Kishida and Joe Biden decide. But if you can get China to station long-range missiles, which they have not done so far, if they can station long-range missiles in China, they've got troops in Okinawa, they've got a massive American presence already. But what they don't have is long-range missiles which can hit China so far. If they can do that, then I think for me, that would represent a paradigm shift in the Japanese defense policy. Because that will mean essentially that Japan, unlike ASEAN and Korea, has said, fine, we have a trade relationship with China, we have an investment relationship with China, but we will say hell with it. First, national interest and national security interest. So far, Japan has made it a point not to allow its troops to work directly under American generals and American command. Although the Americans have a base, the Japanese troops do not take orders from the American general. If this also changes, and I would be interested in knowing what kind of talks happen in Washington, if this can change and a joint task force is created between Japan and the US, that would also mean a paradigm shift. AUKUS, whether they join or not, is less relevant. For me, it is the interoperability. It is taking the relationship between Japan and US in the defense arena to the next level. That is the key. Because if they do that, then we are looking at a situation where something happens in Taiwan. I don't think the Japanese can actually sit back and say, no, we will not get involved. They will get involved. They don't have to say it. Just the fact that military structures will be put in place, which will make it inevitable that they respond when something happens in Taiwan. I want to spend a minute on the Sino-Russian relationship, because it has huge repercussions, not just for the US, but also for India. I believe the West has been short-sighted vis-a-vis Russia, but this you probably know. I really think while you can argue with what Putin has done, and obviously it is unacceptable at one level, I think the West could have handled it differently. Instead, they have chosen to demonize Russia and push Russia into the arms of China. Our Russian experts were right about one thing and wrong about another thing. Russian experts from India were absolutely spot on, and I give them full marks for saying within 1 week of the conflict in Ukraine, I had ex-Indian ambassadors to Russia tell everybody, this is going to be a war of attrition and it will go in favor of Russia. I attributed it to localitis at that time, but they turned out to be absolutely correct, full marks. Where I think they were completely wrong is when everybody of them told me Russia will never accept junior status vis-a-vis China. That is, I think, a load of nonsense, because Russia has simply accepted junior status. I'm not saying it is irreversible. In one of my pieces, I've said it can be reversed in the past. Who knows? Who has seen the future? But for now, there is no doubt, and nobody can argue that Russia is not a junior partner of China. For this, I blame the West in particular. There could have been, Europe should have played a more, shall I say, important role. It's, after all, a conflict in the heart of Europe. They should have taken upon themselves to try and talk to Russia and to try to manage the crisis. But anyway, that's water under the bridge, because now what is happening is, I see two things happening. China is getting more and more drawn into the conflict, because from saying that we will not do anything to bust sanctions and we will not give them lethal weapons, slowly I see China proceeding in that direction. There is now evidence that some of the things that Russia got and some of the success in the Russian war in Ukraine can only be attributed to China. So that is, I think, something that is a recent development. The West will obviously be extremely unhappy. Again, Janet Yellen, who's actually a darling of the Chinese press. So when she says something, you have to take it seriously. She says there will be significant consequences for Russia if they decide to continue in that. Sorry, China. If there's significant consequences for China if they continue to help Russia in the war in Ukraine. But I don't see the Chinese stopping, because I think it is a matter of their ultimate objective, which is, as I said, two objectives. One, promote a non-Western multipolar world order. Second, undermine the US at every level. So these two objectives are fulfilled in the Chinese partnership with Russia. It's not for any love of Russia. I think even Russians know there is no love lost. It is a marriage of convenience in that sense. But it is now, I think, much more than that. They have decided, both have decided to take some irreversible steps in this direction. The US-China friction and what implications for India, and I will stop with that so that we can have an interaction. Chairman, with your permission, just 5 more minutes, if you don't mind.
Please go ahead.
Thank you. So the US-China friction is sought to be managed by Biden and Xi Jinping. None of the fundamentals which are driving this friction can be solved in the near term. And neither of them is even trying to solve it. But there are very important internal considerations why they don't want a conflict right now. America, for obvious reasons, they have 2 theaters of war going on. They don't want a third one. And you've got domestic elections in the United States. China, because Xi Jinping has this economic dilemma, as I said. As I said, contrary to what others think, his central problem is economic. There is no environment in which the Chinese people's lives can be made better. So he doesn't want to make it worse by getting into a conflict with the United States. So it suits both leaders immensely to act like statesmen, which they did in San Francisco and now in a phone call, and say that, listen, relationship is improving. I think this is completely papering over the cracks in the relationship and trying to see how there can be a modicum of rapprochement between the two countries. It suits China because China does not want a fundamental change in the relationship. What China wants is to undermine the US, but at the same time prevent disruption to itself. So it wants a modicum of rapprochement, which is what they have got. So it suits both leaders. But beyond that, I do not believe either leader is out to try and resolve the fundamental problems that affect this relationship. Now, there are those who think in India that a massive friction between China and the United States gives us more strategic space vis-a-vis US and vis-a-vis the West. I'm not sure about the answer to that point. I think in foreign policy, you have to deal with the world you get, not deal with the world you want. So I won't even, speculate on how much of friction is good for India and whether little friction is better or more friction is better. But I think what India faces is an unprecedented security challenge. Except for a few years, there has never been Sino-Russian rapprochement in our neighborhood, except for a few years. I think that is the new development for India. And this is full of negative repercussions for India, because I don't think it's a good idea if Russia starts taking orders from China for India. We still rely on Russia enormously, and everybody knows that when push comes to shove, how Russia will behave is something we will have to wait and see. I think the other big problem for me is we have taken a principled position vis-a-vis China that if there is no de-escalation and disengagement at the border, there can be no normalization of the relationship. I think that's a principled position and a good position. My problem is, I don't think China is likely to pay heed. So then the question will arise as to what we do. That's problem number one. Problem number two, we have said clearly to the Chinese, and our external affairs minister has said it himself, that the three mutuals should guide the relationship. This is mutual respect, mutual sensitivity, and mutual interest. Except a bit for the mutual interest, the Chinese have really not bothered about either mutual respect or mutual sensitivity. And if you go by what they're doing to Arunachal Pradesh, even mutual interest has been thrown off. So we have a problem again. So my question is, and I'm not sure I have an answer, are we looking at a longish period of tension, unpredictability, and a difficult period in a Sino-Indian relationship with absolutely no sign of rapprochement in the near future? After all, as I said in one of my pieces, the two leaders are not talking. And at least in China, it's very clear that nothing happens without Xi Jinping, right? And we too have a strong leader. So with the two leaders not talking, I'm not sure what good is achieved by your having 20 or 30 meetings at the level of armed forces commanders and joint secretaries and so on. With due respect to our illustrious joint secretaries, they're important. But I'm saying, if you have to resolve an issue like this, so what are the options for India? And I promise you, I'll definitely close that. One option for India, which we have exercised already, is that a lattice work of strategic architecture is emerging in the Indo-Pacific, all aimed at countering China. I would like to call it the single most important blunder made by China in its diplomatic endeavors so far. To have the Quad against you, to have the AUKUS against you, to have US, Japan, Korea trilateral against you. You now have the US, Japan, Philippines against you. That takes some doing, frankly. So this is the lattice work of strategic architecture that is emerging in the Indo-Pacific. India is part of the Quad, but I don't put it past India to really do other things, because the more, as I said, time passes and we realize that our non-relationship with China or our tension with China is irreversible, then we have no choice, because the power differential between India and China, as I said, is a factor of 1:5. And this is not going to change anytime soon, unless it becomes something like 1:2, which is why I keep harping, and that will be my last point, we have to become a 10 trillion economy. Then you can argue, even if China is 20 trillion, that is something we can handle. But you cannot handle if it is 20 trillion there and it is 4 trillion here. You can't handle it. So I think the second thing that we can do, the first thing we do is, of course, we will join minilaterals and join this lattice work, as I call it. The second thing I think we have to do is really get our internal economic act together. I think there is an opportunity, which is what I have tried to explain in my book as well. It is India's moment, but this moment is not unlimited in time and space. it has got a particular shelf life because things will change. And that is just the way of things in international relations. So before things change too much, I think India will have to capitalize on this moment, try and do things internally like land reforms, agricultural reforms, do the more difficult ones, get hold of China plus one strategy, get as much investment as you can. Right now, it is Vietnam, which is the big beneficiary, not India. I think we will have to change that. But I think I want to conclude by saying that there is no question in my mind that China is the principal threat for India. That's a no-brainer. But what is interesting for me is the number of fronts which China has opened for itself. This is something I did not expect the Chinese to do because, like many others, I thought China was 10 feet tall. Now I realize it is not 10 feet tall, frankly. I did not expect the Chinese to open so many fronts: Vietnam, Philippines, what do you call it? Japan, India, US. And that is just beyond anybody's diplomatic remit or brief. To have so many fronts and then deal with it. And some of those fronts, especially the ones with India, could have been entirely avoidable. That is my point. But I will conclude here. And once again, Ambassador Nambiar, thank you very much, sir. But really, I'm extremely honored to be able to address an audience like this at the Institute of.
Thank you, Mohan. It's been extraordinarily incisive, your analysis, and I can just about think that virtually everybody is going to ask you some questions. So let us straight away get on to the questions. By perhaps I think Sharon, will you?
Yes, sir.
Yes, go ahead.
Am I audible?
Go ahead.
So
There are some questions in the chat box, as well as I suppose we can ask the people to use the raise hand option.
yes, sir. So the first question is what political, economic, and security lessons India can learn from China's current attempts to supersede USA as would hegemon as and when India becomes number 2 economy in the world and China plus USA led Western world would try to prevent India in the long to longer term?
I don't know whether he's talked of the China plus USA led Western world. Okay, go ahead.
Sir,
Mohan,
I'm back.
will
Sorry
you take
about
a few questions together, or will it? Sorry. Yeah, Mohan.
No, sir, just to tell you, I'm back. There was a problem with the connection, but I finished my speech. Thank you.
Very good. Okay, I know. I've also actually thanked you for your extraordinarily incisive analysis, and it's in a sense it's a straightforward, direct, no nonsense kind of which I think gives us ample food for thought and has obviously, as you can expect, raised a lot of questions. We will get a few questions which perhaps we'll get from raised hands. And as far as I can see, I've already, the one question has been mentioned in the chat box, and that is what lessons, political, economic, and security lessons we can learn from China's current attempt at hegemony in terms of perhaps how to cope with China's own behavior. So I think that is, but he talks about superseding a kind of a bipolar kind of relationship. That bipolar moment is more or less also, I think, I'm not sure how much of this bipolar moment will remain in actual terms. That's one question. And then I will ask Ravi to make his. Would you like to answer that first one straight away? Mohan, I think you are frozen. Hello. I don't know. Is Ritika, is it?
Yes, sir. My screen is frozen.
Screen is frozen. Okay, let us check again. I'm sorry. We're getting. Okay, she's entered again. Okay. I think you got him come back. Yeah. Is it all? Mm-hmm. I think, is he back? Is Mohan back?
Not yet, sir. Not yet.
Okay. He's co-host now, they say?
Yes, sir, he's back.
Okay.
I'm back, sir. I'm back.
Okay. Quickly, and then we will ask Ravi to make a question. Ask his question. Go ahead. Okay, Ravi, would you like to give a question?
Sure. Ambassador, an absolutely outstanding presentation that has really held us spellbound. So my question goes back to a comment you made early in your presentation about the Paris Agreement on climate change in 2015. It really relates to the future of the planet, as it were, which is increasingly becoming more and more dire from the scientific accounts, especially in the last 2 years, when 1.5 degrees has been overtaken in temperature rise. So very briefly, in this scenario that you have shown us about Sino-American rivalry, Sino-Indian conflicts, generally very disturbed geopolitical atmosphere, it looks as if concerted world action on climate change has been completely lost sight of. And thereby, we are spending a lot of energy in all these internal conflicts, security, political, and economic. But ironically, at the end of the day, if as a species we are going to really be wiped out or close to wiped out, it seems to be rather a strange game. So is there something global diplomacy can teach us on how to handle this? In other words, is there a way we can put aside or handle these things separately while giving space to the primacy of climate change? Can you suggest something here? Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead, Mohan.
So, sir, you would prefer that I answer one question after the other?
Okay, you can answer these two questions straight away now, and then we'll go to the next.
No, sorry, I was out. What was the second question?
No, this is the first question. I'll get to that. You start. You can respond to this.
So,
it's a big question.
Right, because I've switched to my mobile phone, sir. It's much better. I've left the, so if you find it strange, so please forgive me. I want to be able to use something which works. Yeah. So, Mr. Ravi Bhuthalingam, thank you so much for those remarks and for the question. I wish I could give you a more optimistic answer, because what I have also spoken and written about is that the big issues of the day, which are climate change, public health, cyber security, and terrorism, will definitely take a back seat. The UN is not working, and the relationship between US and China is so fraught that they are going to continue to talk about fentanyl and and excess capacity. And if Trump comes to power, it will be even worse. Climate change will be relegated even more to the background. So the response to your question is, my hope now lies with commercial entities and local governments. I think local communities, local governments, and companies will have to get their act together. People who live in Greater Noida, people who live in Gurgaon will say, listen, enough is enough. We are going to take over this problem. We will try and see what we can do to make the air quality better. That is already happening in the West, by the way. But it has not yet happened in India, where, we have a tradition of either not doing anything or leaving everything to government. But that is the only way the climate change problem will be resolved. I assure you that money is not a problem. The governments will not give you money, but a lot of private entities will give us money for that. So I think I am now placing all my bets in the local communities, in local governments in many cities, and in civil activists. That is what I think will get us out of this mess. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, Mohan, the first question was what lessons India can learn from China's being number two, as it were, earlier, in terms of how we cope with an economy, and as well as in the strategic field where the Chinese are coping with the UN and with the US and don't have much time for us. What is do you suggest a Deng Xiaoping type of a kind of a response?
Yes, yes, I do, sir. I think that we are reformers by compulsion, not by conviction. Otherwise, we will take another 10 years. You will realize this is a strong government we have in India today. And do you realize this government had to take back both the land reform bill and the farm bills? And look at the irony of it. There are all sorts of other bills being passed, and they're even being rammed through parliament. But the two bills which matter to me and which will get the country out of, this kind of a moronic state of development, that they were not able to do. So I worry about it. And my only prescription is the first 6 months of the next government, the honeymoon period, I think they should just go ahead and do it, not bother about consultation. I know this sounds crazy, and there are enough people who have criticized me, but I have waited long enough. And GST took more than 10 years. The world is not going to wait 10 years. I think the real lesson to the questioner, my answer is, it is that old saying by a Bill Clinton aide, it is the economy stupid. If India becomes 10 trillion, the world will be at your feet, no matter what. They will not care about other things that are happening here. They will just make a beeline to us. I think we should understand that. Nothing else is really important. Just get this, and a lot of other things will follow.
Okay, there's Ritika, tell me if there's another raised hand. I don't see another raised hand, but just one question from the chat box, and that is, what do you see? I think we've already answered the question about hide and bide, Deng Xiaoping, which you said. The other one is, what about BRI-2, and what are its future implications for India and South Asia? You suggest in your statement, you said BRI is now, in a sense, it's stuttering.
No, I think we will have a problem in the sense, if BRI's ambitions are limited, then they will focus much more on the near abroad of China, which is South Asia, unfortunately. So actually, our neighboring countries will fall for it hook, line, and sinker. And I think there is only one way out, sir. I mean, I think India will have to make clear its red lines to our neighboring countries. If you build a road, if you build an energy plant, if you build a bridge, it's fine. Take Chinese money and do whatever hell you want to do. But I don't think a visit by a Chinese nuclear-powered submarine would be welcome. I don't think placing of Chinese satellites on your soil is okay in Maldives or Sri Lanka. Similarly, supply of qualitatively different weapons to Nepal or Bangladesh will make a difference. But other than this, so what I'm saying is, make a distinction between strategic trade and non-strategic trade, and read out the red lines clearly to your neighbors. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, I think Kishan has asked a question when he says that, how do you see China handling the debt crisis that many Chinese BRI borrowers face? It avoids something like debt write-off. It avoids this for for the political risks in terms of domestic backlash. How do you see that working out? And how risky is China's new focus on attempting to master all cutting-edge technologies, while restricting restricting top flyers like Alibaba, Baidu, and the rest?
On the first issue, it will be interesting to see how they handle it. Frankly, I'm not able to give you an answer, because the debt problem is a very serious problem. There is massive public debt overhang. The local governments are all highly indebted. The possibility of non-performing loans is huge, frankly. So I think it's going to be a real problem. I would love now, as far as they will make a distinction between internal debtors and external debtors. Internal debtors, I think they will forgive. They have no choice, frankly. But I don't think they will forgive debt so easily to Kenya, Zambia, and the others. Kenya, they've already taken over the port in Mombasa because the Kenyans have not been able to repay the loan for the railway line. So I think externally they are being very difficult. In the G20 meeting, we noticed that they were most reluctant, frankly, to forgive debt. They said, no, we are not in the same category as IMF, World Bank, and the others. And when the G20 suggested that there must be what is known as a debt service suspension initiative. This was not even a debt forgiveness. It was merely a debt service suspension initiative. And even that, the Chinese were against it, frankly. So I think they will make a distinction between those who owe them from abroad and those who owe them within the country. On the technology mastering all of it, I don't put anything beyond Chinese ingenuity, frankly.
No, but
so
more
I think
state-led technology innovation. How do you see that working?
No. That I think Mr. Xi Jinping is shooting himself in the foot, in my humble view. I frankly think if there is anything that Deng Xiaoping's reforms have demonstrated in China, it is the private sector which led the Chinese miracle. It is not, it is absolutely not the state enterprises which led this. So I'm really surprised how he has gone back to state enterprises. And then, sir, one of the reasons why China benefited was because of forced technology transfer. Now, forced technology transfer will not happen because Western companies have become wise. That used to happen, forced technology transfer. In every investment, there was forced technology transfer. But I don't think that will happen now. The Western countries have become wise. So it is all up to indigenous development of technology. I'm not able to guess whether they'll be able to do that. But I think that looks bleak, according to me.
Third question, if I may, again, is from Ashutosh Vashisht, who talks about how will the trade war focused on electric vehicles impact the relationship between China and US? And what are the ramifications it will have for India? Is it which is aiming to be a prominent player in EV manufacturing?
So it has got huge repercussions, not just for America, for Europe. A lot of electric vehicles, companies like Siemens and others. I mean, I'm sorry, Mercedes and BMW are also, investing in this. And if the Chinese are allowed to get away with this, there will be a major problem. So I think it is not just US, but also Europe. I think the ramifications are serious. It will cause a lot of tension between the two countries. The easy way out is to impose huge tariffs on Chinese cars. But the problem is the Chinese may even get around that issue. So we will have to wait and see. As far as implications for India is concerned, I think we should grab every opportunity that comes our way to develop these kind of technologies. But I don't think India will ever rival China. So it would be wrong to say that we will ever threaten the US or the EU. We have not reached that level, and it's going to be years and years. So I think whatever help we can get from the West, they will also be happy to help, because I don't think we are going to threaten them in this area.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, there's one question from Shreya Mishra, who talks about e-commerce as a fast emerging crucial in WTO negotiations and a major point of divergence between India and China over conceptions of cyber sovereignty. China's and India's own data privacy concerns and digital infra divide. With China and India being biggest stakeholders in the negotiations, what are the key points we need to be mindful of in handling Chinese negotiating stance? This is from Shreya Mishra.
Yeah. So Shreya, it's like this. I think there are only three models available on e-commerce. One is the Chinese model, where it is, everything is Weibo and WeChat and whatever, and the government controls a lot of it. You've got the American model, where the government has very little to do with it. Microsoft and the Mark Zuckerberg model, as I call it. I think India is trying to follow the middle path, which is represented by the EU, the General Data Regulation Act of the EU. Unfortunately, we have not been successful in either impressing our own civil activists within the country or EU, our external partners, on the exceptions that we want on grounds of national security. I think India wants a very broad kind of exception on national security that neither EU nor the US are able to accept. It will become clearer in the course of our negotiations on FTA with EU, because our negotiations on FTA with EU includes e-commerce, and we will be required to make some serious concessions. But once we make those concessions and EU is satisfied, then India will not budge. Then that will become the paradigm for everybody. So that I'm waiting for those negotiations to conclude. China is in a different category, Shreya, so I don't think we should compare ourselves with China at all.
Final one question. I don't know if I've missed out anything. This one from Amit Dogra, which says, how to get Japan to work decisively against China? What can India do as part of our policy?
India needs to do very little. I tried to say in my speech that Japan is doing things which were inconceivable 10 years ago. Their defense posture has changed. Their own requirement for weapons has changed. I mean, I have only read articles which say that this meeting between Kishida and Biden is likely to be very, very important from a defense point of view. And in many ways, it is very unlikely that Kishida, who's very low profile and soft-spoken and not like Shinzo Abe at all, has actually taken things much more forward than what people imagine. He has gone very much ahead of what Shinzo Abe and others have talked about Japan. So I think, like I said, if there is a defense partnership between US and Japan, which is clarified, and it will have to be clarified, as I said, from two aspects. One, which is, what do you call it? This business of stationing long-range missiles in Japan. So far, they have been reluctant not to really unnerve China. But if they do it, that will be big. Secondly, somehow Japanese forces and American forces working together. That if they can sort out these two, I don't think India needs to do much at all. The only thing India can do is provide Japan an alternative to the Chinese market. This I have been begging everybody. Please give them an alternative. Why should Japan invest in China? It should be investing in India. But if India does not provide a conducive environment, then you can't blame the Japanese. You have to provide a conducive environment and tell them that, listen, your China plus one strategy should be India, not Vietnam. That's the only thing India can do.
Thank you. I don't know if there's any further questions. Ritika, is there any? I can't see any. Well, I think sorry. Yes.
So there's this question on if there is any update on the sunset clause articulated by you for India.
Sunset clause articulated by you?
What is the sunset clause in the context of which agreement, please?
I don't know what the context is.
Defense production.
Defense production. No. Look, I think it's a process of negotiation that is going on. I'm not sure how it will play out, but defense negotiations is something that it is between the PMO and the Defense Ministry. My own feeling is, I think anything that gets us investment and it can somehow transfer technology, I'll be happy. You have a sunset clause, don't have a sunset clause, but as long as technology is transferred and as long as HAL and others can absorb the technology, I'm happy. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't know whether have we come to the, I think we've already reached, what's your time frame, Ritika? Any further questions?
So we can take questions, but I'm not sure if someone else
I saw one from Ranjit Ray. I'm not sure I saw it clearly. So it's about...
Ranjit, would you like to? like to ask a question? I don't know. He doesn't seem to.
No, no. I think his question was, if I understood, he says, I made the point that the issue of the Sino-Indian border dispute can only be resolved by the two leaders, and his question was, will a Modi second term, not a second term, the next term of Modi, will the policy change? That's a tough one. I'm not sure I know the right answer to the question. But frankly, Ranjit, and if you are the same Ranjit that you think I am, that I think you are, then I think, Ranjit, the answer is something has to budge, because they are not going to pay heed to us. So I think they are playing on the fact that stationing a large number of troops in Ladakh is proving to be expensive for India, which it is, frankly. So they are trying to play on that. So we will have to wait and see. If the Chinese are rational about it, and if they want to reduce one front, for example, I understand finally they are sending a Chinese ambassador to India. After a gap, I think they've asked for agrimo or something. But so there, it's possible that the Chinese realize, okay, let's sort this one out. If that happens, it happens. But I don't see a huge policy change from India. That's my sense.
Thank you. Thank you. If there are no more questions, I think we may have to. Sorry, yes, go ahead. Ritika.
Sorry, sir. So there's another question that we skipped.
Okay,
It's
which
from
one?
Priyanka Keshri.
Okay, go ahead.
So the question goes, how might India-US relations be affected if US-China relations improve significantly? What concerns might India have regarding Janet Yellen's recent visit to China?
So this is what I hinted at in my speech, as to whether you think the transformative or the consequential the most consequential relationship is how it is being described in the US and India. Is it entirely due to the friction that US is having with China? Is it entirely attributable to the fact that the US wants to use India as a counter to China? I don't believe that, frankly. That factor may have something to do with the overall relationship, but then there are so many other things that are happening in the bilateral relationship between India and the US that I don't think we should be unduly worried if there is a total rapprochement between US and China. Having said that, I am reasonably convinced the relationship is in dire straits. And I think I said in my speech that the two leaders were merely trying to paper over the cracks. So I do not see the US changing its mind about China in the near term, which is that China is the pacing challenge for the US. I don't think that will change in the near term.
Thank
We
you.
have another question.
Okay, what's that? Which one is that?
And it's to Ambassador Nambiar. The question goes, what prompted India for a rapprochement in 1980s with China? Do you feel we are being pushed into similar circumstances currently by China to get a rapprochement from our end?
Well, I don't know. I think the situation is quite different as between the 80s and today. In the 80s, actually, even as Mohan has mentioned, the difference between the two countries in terms of even the economies was hardly as vast as it is now. It is today almost 5 times. Earlier, it was not quite as different. And secondly, during Deng Xiaoping's initial reform and opening up, he had sincerely believed in the fact he's actually said it to Rajiv Gandhi that Asia's development, if the 21st century is to be called the Asian century, that century would not happen unless both India and China can develop. And for that, he talked about developing together. That I don't think is particularly shared today by the new leadership, if you are to go even by what Mohan has just said. Because as he said, they think that today they alone ultimately can in a sense, stride the Asian kind of landscape. even the seascape they feel. So I think there is a difference, a basic difference in the approach. And for us to think that we can get back to it, I did think at one stage that that would be possible, but I increasingly think that it can only be possible once, as Mohan said, our economic strength goes to somewhere which is even remotely comparable, or at least can be placed in a position where it can be noticeable vis-a-vis a country, like the stage that China is reaching. And that he has put at a $10 trillion economy. And I think that something like that has to happen before we get to being in any kind of a similar situation to look for a rapprochement of the 80s. That's my position. Now, I think we can, do we now wrap up at this stage, or is there any further questions that are? Mohan, that's been a spectacular sort of exchange you've had, and I think your analysis has been fantastic. 2 points I can just say. Obviously, I'm not planning to sum up. One is what you said about the economy. Unless India is going, if India is to reach anywhere close to a kind of a zone of consideration in the overall international strategic landscape, I did tell somebody else there was this. In fact, you talked about the Pacific, and there is I keep talking about this book which was written by two US. It's a novel written by two US naval people about 2034, and it gives a very interesting role to India. But that also, I think, places India in a situation in terms of comprehensive national strength, which is more or less where you have placed it. One. Secondly, so economy, it's the economy stupid, as you said. Secondly, the role of leadership in this kind, it's more than the economy, more than the political structure. The role of leadership, national leadership, is something which even the Chinese have been talking about. I mentioned Yen Shui-tung. That's one thing you're saying. Ultimately, it's the leadership that, of course, you have now today in China a leadership which is in a sense untrammeled. So it has an advantage in many ways, but the position of the leadership in terms of the worldview he is taking is also now completely changing. Now, how that will evolve is something which at this stage we can't say, because as you were saying, the private sector is actually becoming less and less visible and influential. The state sector is becoming more and more influential. Now, a top-down approach in most economic decision-making and in resource mobilization is taking place, more importantly. And this role, the earlier role of the local authorities is now being challenged, partly because the local authorities have also gone all over the place in some ways, and that is causing huge debt problems. Now, these are the kinds of things which I think will have to be, in many ways, will be relevant even in terms of India's coming up, as it were, as we get into any zone of consideration in the international landscape. I think that you have underlined very, very, very sort of adeptly in your presentation. It remains for me only to thank you, Mohan, for this extremely useful and very practical and very direct kind of presentation and analysis. I think everybody will have enjoyed it very, very immensely. Thank you very much, Mohan. Go ahead, Ritika.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador. I seek your permission to formally bring an end to today's session.
Yeah, go ahead.
With this, yes, sir. With this, we come to an end of today's seminar. We thank Ambassador Mohan Kumar and Ambassador Vijay K. Nambiar for gracing today's seminar with their presence and for giving us their precious time. The video of today's seminar shall be available on the ICS's YouTube channel. We extend our invitation to you to join us for an engaging book discussion on Contemporary China, Tradition and Modernity, authored by Ms. Poonam Suri. The discussion will take place on 16 April 2024, Tuesday at 3 p.m. IST. Details about the event can be found on the ICS website, or you can subscribe to our newsletters for timely updates. Thank you everyone for joining.